The Crucifixion, a hotly contested topic amongst Christians and Muslims. The mainstream Muslim narrative is that one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, Judas Iscariot, took the place of Jesus on the cross while Jesus was lifted to heaven. On the other hand, Christians believe that Jesus was placed on the cross where he died. They believe he was resurrected in his tomb and later ascended to heaven. My journey led me here. I wanted to look into what really happened to Jesus, since from both a historical and biblical point of view, it is quite clear the crucifixion did indeed take place, and it was Jesus who was put on the cross. So what happened to Jesus leading up to crucifixion? I traced his footsteps back and looked into how a humble man, a messenger of God who was born a virgin birth, was ultimately turned on by the very people he was sent by God to reform. As Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. The geographic scope of Jesus' mission was confined to where the Israelites lived. He was a follower of Moses and did not change or reject the Mosaic law. The New Testament declares that Jesus came only to fulfill the law and not abolish it. From the moment Jesus started preaching, there was opposition. This opposition is what ultimately caused the crucifixion to take place. The chronology of the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection is highlighted in the Bible. On the day before the burial, Jesus eats the Last Supper with his disciples. Later that night, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when it appeared that there was no way to avoid the plans of the Jews to have him crucified, Jesus prays to God, as stated in the Gospel of Luke. He says, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. This is the most important prayer offered by Jesus, and is portrayed vividly in the Gospels. It is inconceivable that this prayer of Jesus did not reach the divine throne, especially as Jesus taught his disciples the power of prayer. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. That same night, Jesus is arrested and brought before the high priest. The next day, Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate, the governor of the Roman province of Judea. Pilate eventually gives in to the demand of the Jews and allows Jesus to be crucified as a riot begins to develop. However, Pilate then asks for a bowl of water. He washes his hand before the crowd and exclaims, "I am innocent of the blood of this man. The responsibility is yours." In the New Testament, there is testimony that Pilate believed Jesus to be innocent and does not want him executed at all. One of the influences was a dream Pilate's wife had convincing her of Jesus' innocence. The message she passes on to Pilate is, "Leave that innocent man alone." According to the Gospel of Mark, at around 9 a.m., Jesus is put on the cross. The Gospel of Matthew says he is removed from the cross at around 3 p.m. the very same day, having been on the cross now for a total of 6 hours. On the cross, there are 2 thieves alongside Jesus, both of whom have their legs broken by the soldiers. The Gospel of John says, "But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out." What always intrigued me about this verse is the statement, "blood and water gushing forth." The coagulation of blood, livor mortis, starts 20 to 30 minutes after death. Simply put, blood does not squirt or gush out. When the news of the supposed death of Jesus reaches Pilate, he was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. Pilate's testimony is extremely revealing. Here is a man who is likely the most knowledgeable regarding the punishment of crucifixion, and he is shocked to hear that Jesus died in such a short amount of time. Though the details of crucifixion were lost at the end of the Roman Empire, there are various records proving that this particular punishment took at least 2 to 3 days to kill a person. The New Bible Dictionary also concludes, based on the historical facts of crucifixion, that death by this method was usually quite protracted, rarely supervening before 36 hours, and on occasion taking as long as 9 days. Furthermore, in the 1st century AD, historian Flavius Josephus describes survivors of crucifixions. The writer Plutarch mentions some individuals surviving up to 10 days on the cross. And analysis of the Gospels clearly reveals Pilate was interested in saving Jesus' life while trying to maintain official execution procedure as mandated by Roman law. 3 key points may be noted here. 1. Pilate set the crucifixion just before the Sabbath, as Jewish law prohibits specifically bodies to hang on the cross by the start of the Sabbath. Death was unlikely in 6 hours. 2. When the time came to remove Jesus on the cross, the Jews asked Pilate to break the legs of Jesus. As mentioned earlier, the centurions acting on Pilate's command did not break the legs of Jesus. It was because he had taken these precautionary measures that Pilate was surprised when he was told that Jesus was dead already. 3. Roman protocol was that the body would lie on crucifixion grounds and be subject to the elements and animals. However, Pilate allowed something quite unusual to take place. Instead of giving Jesus' body to his enemies, Pilate gave the body to his friends. According to the Gospel of John, just before sunset, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jews, asked Pilate to let him remove the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So Joseph came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had previously come to Jesus at night, also brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. So they took the body of Jesus and wrapped it in linen cloth with the spices, according to the Jewish burial custom. Myrrh and aloe are ancient healing agents. They have proven to even heal ulcers in people, and interestingly enough, the Gospel of John states that anointing a body with myrrh and aloe is also a Jewish burial custom, even though it isn't, and never was. So, why was Jesus' body rubbed with healing ointments if he was dead? Consider the sign of Jonah mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. Prior to the crucifixion, some scribes and Pharisees asked Jesus for proof that he was indeed the Messiah. "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." Jesus replies, "A wicked and adulterous generation demands a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." According to biblical tradition, Prophet Jonah never died in the belly of the fish. So could the same be said for Jesus? A 200-year-old hypothesis that is still the subject of debate to this day is the swoon theory, the belief that Jesus did not die on the cross, but merely fell unconscious, that he swooned. The origins of this hypothesis begin with Karl Friedrich Barth, who in 1780 wrote that Jesus deliberately feigned his death, using drugs provided by the physician Luke to appear as a spiritual Messiah and to get Israel to abandon the idea of a political Messiah. A second rationalist theologian, Henrik Paulus, wrote in 1802 that he believed Jesus had fallen into a temporary coma and somehow revived without help in the tomb. However, both theories do not go into detail about how Jesus survived and what happened to him post-crucifixion. It would not be until 1899 that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam, who claimed to have been divinely appointed as the promised Messiah and the metaphorical second coming of Jesus, stated that Jesus was saved from death upon the cross, unconscious from the trauma. He was revived in the tomb by use of the ointment of Jesus, which was applied by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. This ointment helped Jesus recover. Following this, God revealed to him that Jesus migrated eastwards towards India in order to preach to the lost tribes of Israel. From the high day Sabbath up until the weekly Sabbath, Jesus was in the tomb. It wasn't until Sunday that his tomb was found empty, and there are various contradictory points in the Bible on what happened after Jesus was taken down from the cross. When the missing body is discovered, there are more contradictory accounts. It is widely believed that the aforementioned account from Mark chapter 16 verses 9 to 20 is a much later insertion which is not found in the earlier manuscripts of the New Testament Gospels. However, the later edition asserts that Jesus appeared to the 11 disciples, telling them to preach to the whole world. Conversely, in Matthew, the 11 disciples went to the mountain which Jesus had designated in Galilee. When they saw him there, they worshipped him, but some were doubtful. Jesus then told his disciples to preach, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations." In Luke, the disciples were startled and thought that they were seeing a spirit. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." He shows them his hands and feet and asks, "Have you anything here to eat?" They then give him a piece of fish which he takes and eats right in front of them. But according to John, in the evening on the same day, Jesus meets his disciples behind closed doors for fear of the Jews, and he shows them his hands, feet, and his sides. According to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus makes this appearance to all 11 surviving disciples. Paul's version mentions the presence of all 12 apostles, although Judas had long since died. Contrary to all this, John's story places only 10 disciples at the scene, Thomas being absent. Strangely, Paul never mentions the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. He also does not mention the empty tomb, the appearances to the disciples, or the ascension of Jesus into heaven. Many scholars, including Konstantin von Tischendorf, the noted German biblical scholar and author of Critical Edition of the New Testament, generally agree that the author of Mark purposely stopped at chapter 16, verse 8. This means that the original version of the Gospel did not describe any post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. According to the later additional verses of Mark, Jesus went up to heaven and sat at the right hand of God. But there is no clear evidence that this was an accurate reference. There is only one account of the ascension in Luke chapter 24, verses 50 to 51. This was also omitted in the early ancient texts. The cross-reference to the ascension is in Acts chapter 1, verses 9 to 12. The author of Acts is also Luke. So if the original reference was omitted in Luke, then it does not have much credibility in Acts. Because of all these conflicting accounts and contradictions, the resurrection narratives would be deemed unreliable and a cause for real concern. In fact, it appears that the resurrection became a growing legend over time as the Gospels slowly emerged, one by one, several decades after the crucifixion. The main issue to bear in mind is how can it be possible that such a crucial tenet of the Christian faith be recorded so poorly and inaccurately? The gospel narratives clearly indicate that the appearances to the disciples were real. The evidence that the New Testament narratives provide is that Jesus was alive and not roaming the world in a supernatural state as a ghost or a spirit. He had all the faculties of a living human being, expressing the need to physically eat and drink, and his followers could touch his physical body. He was disguising himself and was hiding out of fear of persecution. Yet he was mindful of his incomplete mission and continued to guide his disciples while in hiding. All of these facts indicate that he was not God. For argument's sake, even if he was, then why would there be a need for God to be incarnated and resurrected? It is very likely that the idea of the physical resurrection was borrowed from the idea of God's being expected to raise people bodily from the dead. Associating this idea with Jesus would have been a very easy mistake to make at the time, since Christian beliefs rely on the historical event of the resurrection. If Jesus was not bodily resurrected, he was not God. He did not redeem mankind. As Paul says, "If Christ is not risen, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins." The fact remains that God saved Jesus from dying as a result of the most extreme, shameful form of punishment, crucifixion. Cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. Jesus has been a dominant figure in history for over the last 2,000 years. But evidence continues to come to light to prove that Jesus did not die on the cross, he was not resurrected, and he did not ascend to heaven. Prior to his crucifixion, Jesus instructed the disciples, "Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But when they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another, for verily I say unto you, you shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come." So it is clear that Jesus survived crucifixion, was revived in the tomb, and ultimately escaped persecution, and continued on his mission in search of the lost sheep of Israel. So where did he go then? This brings me to the final part of my journey.
2,000 years ago, the world was at a low spiritual ebb. The days of the biblical prophets were past. Then one man, Jesus of Nazareth, in 3 short years changed the course of history forever.
وجعلنا ابن مريم وأمه